Hello and welcome to the podcast series Care Well Conversations, raising awareness about the issues and challenges facing family carers who combine work and care. By engaging with employers, HR professionals, employee representative organisations, family carers and the research community. My name is Brian Doyle. I'm the podcast series producer and a researcher with the Care Well Project, a collaboration between University College Dublin and Family Carers Ireland, funded by the Health Research Board. The overall aim of the Care Well Research Project is to promote health and self-care among working family carers. And over the course of this podcast series, we will have conversations with those who have a role to play in supporting working family carers and begin to tease out the challenges and issues facing them and their employers.
Hello and welcome to the Care Well Conversations podcast series. I'm Dr. Linda Dowling-Hetherington from the UCD College of Business and the UCD Care Well team. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Cara McGann, Head of Social Policy at IBEC, the Irish Business and Employers Confederation. Cara, you're most welcome.
Thanks very much, Linda.
I'm looking forward, Cara, to talking today about the employer perspective on supporting carers in the workplace. So I suppose maybe just to start with, could you just tell us a little bit about IBEC and its role?
Certainly, yeah. So IBEC is Ireland's largest lobby and business representative group. So our purpose really is to build a better, sustainable future by influencing, supporting and delivering for business success. We've got over 250 employees and we have a range of stakeholders in Ireland and internationally throughout our 6 regional offices in Ireland, our Brussels office, and then we have an extensive international network across the UK and the US. So our positions on various topics are very much shaped by our diverse membership. We range from small to large companies, domestic to multinational organisations, and we've got 39 trade associations which cover a really wide range of industry sectors. Our members employ over 70% of the private sector workforce in Ireland. And I suppose as well as lobbying, we also provide a wide range of professional services and management training to our members on all aspects of human resource management, occupational health and safety, employee relations and employment law.
Very good. And your role there, Cara, as Head of Social Policy, I'm really interested to learn a little bit about what that involves and what your various responsibilities might be.
Certainly, yeah. I suppose my role is very varied. I lobby at a national and a European level and would provide strategic advice and support to stakeholders. So from employers to government departments, I would work with employers, government departments, NGOs on different topics on a range of business issues. So across the labour market, things like labour market activation and talent, diversity and inclusion issues like the gender pay gap reporting, gender equality, LGBT issues, mental health, disability and cultural diversity, human rights, immigration, well-being, and so on. And then I also represent business in different fora on different national topics.
Okay, interesting. And I suppose with the Care Well project that UCD and Family Carers Ireland are working on, one of the areas we're examining at the moment is how employers support carers in the workplace. And I'm just wondering if that issue has featured in the work of IBEC in recent years.
It very much has, I suppose. It's been an area that we have been looking at for a number of years now. We're very conscious that we have an ageing population and thankfully people are living longer. But as such, it's becoming more prevalent to have a number of carers in the workplace, and it really is a growing number of employees. Many employees find themselves members of that sandwich generation, so caught between childcare maybe on one hand and long-term care on the other. And obviously we have great statistics from Family Carers Ireland regarding the 1 in 9 carers who are employees. And this role is typically falling to people who are in the prime of their careers, and we need to retain those individuals. And it's probably never truer than now as we experience a labour and a talent shortage. And we're very clear, I suppose, that caring is going to affect every employee at some stage, if not now, then into the future. So if we fail to, I suppose, embrace a carer-friendly workplace, we really risk losing that talent from the workplace. And research tells us that where carers are supported in the workplace, there's huge benefits for retention, for reduced stress, sick leave, absenteeism, as well as improved morale and engagement. So it is very much on our agenda.
Yeah, excellent. And I suppose again, one of the issues that we're looking at as part of the CareWell project is around raising awareness. And often you find when you speak to carers, they talk about, perhaps that the employer wasn't aware of their caring circumstances and so on. So I just wonder, again, from the perspective of IBEC, what you've been doing to raise this agenda and to highlight this agenda at a national level.
Sure. So part of how we would raise awareness is that we featured carers in our budget submissions asks, if you like, over the last number of budget submissions. So we've looked for a suite of supports for carers and the caring industry to be introduced, which would ultimately help support labour market participation in this society. So they would include things like investment in supports for family carers, including the expansion of respite care hours, training in basic care, support for training, continuous professional development and career paths in the home care industry, and a significant increase in the home supports budget to really provide for an additional 5 million hours of in-home support. We also feature care then in our Better Lives, Better Business policy campaign. And this is a policy campaign we've been running for a number of years, which really outlines an ambition for Ireland to invest ambitiously in our people, our regions, and their needs for the betterment of society and the economy. Because if we're going to remain attractive to both local and globally mobile talent, the country and our regions have to offer people a good place to both live and work. And if Ireland's going to continue to be a place where talent wants to be, then we have to translate this into sustained and tangible improvements in our quality of life across the country. And that means overcoming challenges, including those of inadequate care provision. So we really see care as part of that social infrastructure that's core to our ambitions in this area. And I suppose finally then, most recently, it featured in our submission to the Commission of Tax and Social Welfare, as we feel there's a number of reforms really required to support people who have caring responsibilities. So we come at it from a number of different areas, but those would be our primary awareness raising pieces.
Okay. And you mentioned a moment ago there, Cara, that Family Carers Ireland statistic, around 1 in 9 employees have a caregiving responsibility of some kind. And, again, I wonder, if you look at the workplace level, are there practical things that an employer could be doing now to help support those individuals? Because as you said, even if you're not caring now, at some point in the future, each employee in your business is going to be caring for somebody or other. So what are the practical day-to-day things they might do to better support those individuals?
So I suppose we see with different companies, some are more aware of the situation than others. And oftentimes that can be maybe due to the age profile of their workforce, even though we know we have carers at every age. But some have been more aware maybe because of that, or because somebody has come forward maybe to engage on the topic. But I don't think we've been fully aware of the challenges that balancing work and care can have on individuals until recently. And I think through the work of the likes of Family Carers Ireland, and that education and awareness piece has been really, really important to shine a spotlight on the challenges that are faced by working carers. So I think it's an area that's growing with employers and HR managers. We've seen that often carers were very much invisible in the workplace, and anecdotally many talked about keeping their head down and coming and going as they needed to, maybe hoping not to be noticed before they were back at their desk. But that's a huge stressor, and it's really not sustainable. So I think the pandemic, in a sense, has shone a spotlight on the needs of employees in this area, particularly when services were removed, things like home care, or employees were trying to juggle work with filling that gap and meeting the needs themselves. And employers really aimed to be flexible and meet employees where they were at, whether that was offering leave or allowing them to kind of work around care as suited. So we really saw employers step up where they could. I suppose it was also harder to hide, because some people we know intentionally keep their work lives separate, and that can be maybe because it's an escape. And for others, it can be because it's fear of not being seen as committed to their career if there's something else going on in their lives. So I think for many people, the pandemic leveled things a bit and maybe demonstrated how big an issue it is for working carers. And I don't think that was a bad thing. But what we're seeing, I guess, with people is really that if somebody's going to disclose that they have caring responsibilities, they really have to feel safe in the culture to do so. And many of us have a work persona, maybe as we don't often feel safe or secure enough to reveal to others what makes us, human in order to be seen as professional or competent and successful, or not outside of the norm. And certainly that seems to be something that we have seen people with juggling care responsibilities and trying to manage that. So I think it's really important practically that the workplace is one that is a safe culture to disclose that there's caring responsibilities, and then it allows the employer to work with the individual practically to see how we can put supports in place. We have a very active diversity forum with IBEC members in it, and we very recently kind of polled them around this whole area of care, and the majority of them, the practical supports were around flexible working and trying to work with the individual to get an arrangement that was going to work best. We've also introduced, I suppose originally we introduced it for the whole area of disability, the idea of a reasonable accommodation passport, and we would have worked with ICTU on creating this. So it was a document which was kind of a living document where an employee could sit down with their employer and talk about what accommodations or flexibilities they might need to manage their particular condition and make sure they were able to fulfill their potential in the workplace. And it was a live document. It meant they didn't have to keep having this conversation every time they went for a promotion or got a new manager or supervisor. And it was a very useful tool. And now we've found a lot of employers are actually using that in the workplace for caring responsibilities. So again, people can have this conversation, they can have it once, but they can equally review it every couple of months to make sure it's still, relevant, or maybe they need to change because things have disimproved or maybe even improved, and they can adjust things again. So I think the first step really is that disclosure piece, but only if it's safe to do so. And then the employer can really step in and look at what practically can be done.
Yeah, really interesting. And I suppose I'm thinking about an employer as well, Carol, who this hasn't been on their agenda to date, really. I'm wondering about the Keep Well mark, IBEC's employee or workplace wellbeing accreditation. Could that perhaps be something that they could use as a starting point to at least open up the conversations around this whole area of caregiving in the workplace and, balancing that with work, etc.?
I think certainly it could. I mean, the Keep Well mark looks at the totality of well-being. And we know that when people feel they can bring their whole selves to work, they are definitely more engaged, less stressed, productive and healthy. And the reverse is true also. So a company that has a focus on well-being is very much focused on how they set a culture of wellness in their workplace to enable people to fulfill their potential and that of the organization. And so we've a great community now of committed organizations who have that focus on their well-being agenda and tackle it from various angles on the mental and physical health side, nutrition, and a general culture that focuses on individual wellness. So it definitely would be a culture that supports people who have this caring responsibility and are really looking at, what do they need to be well in themselves, both inside and outside of the workplace, so that they are, supported in that particular role. So I definitely think it's a really good tool that could be used as a starting point for sure.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned, or you kind of touched briefly earlier on, Cara, around the business case for supporting carers. And I'm keen to hear a little bit more perhaps around your perspective on that, because, how important is it from a business case perspective that organizations do start to focus a bit more on how they can support carers?
I think it's very important. It's an area that isn't going anywhere, and it's going to grow in importance in the coming years, whether we talk about it or we don't. And also, I suppose, very much at this time when we're experiencing a real war for talent and labour shortages, we can't afford to lose people from our organisations who, if given a little bit of support, could remain functioning and contributing members of our workforce. Similarly, I think if your organisation's committed to diversity and inclusion, carers are part of that equation. They reflect your customers and they have diverse perspectives to bring to the table as a result of their experience. And that's really valuable and it's really important to capture. So, I think from a business case perspective, this is an absolute no-brainer. You know what I mean? It is the reality for people's lives, and very much, something we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned flexible working arrangements a moment ago. And of course, with many organizations have perhaps some formal flexible working practices in place. What kinds of things have you seen organizations actually do in that area, and perhaps even some of the more informal flexible arrangements as well?
It's interesting. We recently discussed this at one of our diversity forums, and I think for many, the approach really has focused either on flexibility or support. That seemed to be the two sides people were kind of coming down on. So flexibility in terms of whether it was the way people work or in enabling time off from medical appointments or to start early or late to accommodate caring responsibilities. So that was, I suppose, the main feature. And then on the support side, many were offering the use of employee assistance programs or employee resource groups to provide support or tools or tips to working carers. Some had taken that further then also by connecting with the likes of Family Carers Ireland and their Caring Employers Initiative, who provided workshops for carers. And talking to employers who engaged with this, they found that the feedback from their employees was very much around not feeling alone or feeling that there were other people out there, colleagues who were going through the same thing, and taking real comfort and support from that. Also feeling that their employer rather cared about them to invest in this time. Others talked about really valuing the workshops that covered very practical things like the Fair Deal scheme, which was so daunting for those considering using it. So it's probably been quite a variety of policies and practices in this regard.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about carers, of course, is, no two carers are alike, perhaps in terms of circumstances, perhaps the support available to them outside the workplace, etc. So, I think that's perhaps something for employers to think about, really, is that, what you put in place, it is going to be a variety, perhaps, of support mechanisms. I mean, one of the things that our research is certainly suggesting is that formal flexible working arrangements are really important to have there. But the informal flexibility is perhaps sometimes even more important for some carers. It's like what you mentioned there a moment ago. It's being able to say to your employer today, the person I'm caring for has a medical appointment. I need to have a shorter lunch or a longer lunch today. And it's sometimes those perhaps ad hoc, perhaps short notice situations too, that I think it's important, to consider how we might accommodate those as well.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it is. And that, I suppose, comes back to that culture. The culture in the workplace that says it's safe to have those conversations and it's not going to have a detrimental. I mean, for many people, caring is actually part of their lives and they've been doing it all the way along, without the employer maybe even knowing until there's maybe a crisis. That shows you a huge amount of resilience, but it also shows that people, when they're committed, with that bit of support, it enables them to continue being productive members of the team. So, would that not make more sense to everybody if we have that little bit of give and take and we can get the job done? And I think the pandemic has shown us maybe a lot of lessons in those kind of areas, maybe not in conditions that we would ever like to replicate, but it has shown what's possible. And I think we need to build back better now as we come out of the pandemic in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think, is there more that an employer could be doing to support carers now? Or are there other things that perhaps need to be considered or we should be looking to implement?
I think it's probably going to become more and more of a priority over the coming years as that number of working carers continues to increase, and maybe twinned with the fact that we've this published government strategy around, Sláinte Care, healthy age-friendly homes and so on, that says we want to keep people in their homes as long as possible. And so it follows that we're likely to have the need for supports for working carers even more so than ever before. So I think there's always more work to be done, and it also has to be incorporated into the range of other priorities being looked at in the workplace as well.
Okay. And the Carers Leave Act, Cara, the aim of that is, just ensuring that, again, carers have the support, they can gain access to a period of leave and so on. And I just wondered, to what extent do you feel employers are aware of the rights and entitlements of carers under that particular legislation?
I think it varies hugely For some, personally or professionally, it is on their radar and they've proactively addressed it, while for others it hasn't been a focus and the awareness would be weaker. Many may not access the details actually until it comes up as an issue for an employee, whereas for others they cover it in a policy on life stages or equivalent, and see it maybe as a likely issue for some of their workforce, and then proactively address it or outline available supports. So I do think it varies greatly, but I think that will increase, as time continues. I think we've seen more of a focus on it now.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the UK, Employers for Carers UK was set up in 2009 with the aim of ensuring that employers have the support to retain and manage employees with caring responsibilities. And I suppose it begs the question then whether something similar might be useful in Ireland.
I think it would be very useful, that, source of dedicated expertise for employers to navigate maybe through these challenges. We see it with our diversity forum. People bring to the table, a particular challenge they're coming up with, and the best practice in the room, people are very generous at sharing their ideas of maybe what they tried and what worked and what didn't work. So having a dedicated expertise there that an employer could engage with, I think would be very valuable. I have to say though, we've had huge supports over queries like these with Family Carers Ireland over the last few years. So they've been a huge resource to us and to employers in that area in the interim.
Yeah, and with the employers that you have been working with, Cara, have you come across any examples of good practice in terms of the kind of supports that employers are offering to carers?
Well, I suppose one area that definitely we've seen quite usefully implemented is that reasonable accommodation passport that I mentioned, because it is a living document and it can be updated and adjusted as circumstances change, and its structure allows this full and frank conversation on the needs, and it's in the control of the employee. It's the employee who chooses to it kind of enact it, or have that conversation starter, and it's in a way that kind of can talk through what the concerns are, what the kind of the obstacles or problem areas might be, and what kind of supports can help, because they're often very small things, as you say, maybe an extension of a lunch break or a slightly later start or end time, nothing too dramatic in many cases. So it's a very useful tool. And being a living document, it means that it is reviewed, so that it's not a case of it's one and done. It's very much a kind of it's an interactive piece. I think others that we've seen really good practices around are those who have brought that caring employers initiative into their workplace. So companies like Irish Life and Bank of Ireland, in partnership with Family Carers Ireland, have had that real success, and the workshops and the counselling and the awareness raising that maybe gave employees who had caring responsibilities, or those who maybe felt that was coming down the track at them, gave them some comfort, gave them some solidarity maybe with their colleagues, and also very, very practical advice and information that maybe they'd been struggling to access anywhere else. So I think that those two pieces have stood out for me very much as very practical ways in which employers can put initiatives in place and really give a proper focus to the whole area of care. And that's on top of things like flexible arrangements and others. But those two, I suppose, stand out most.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned earlier on, Cara, as well, about you touched on kind of culture and creating that carer-friendly organisation. And so I suppose if you switch to looking at the challenges or the barriers or obstacles perhaps that an employer might face, I mean, what are the kind of main challenges that you certainly come across that perhaps so far, employers perhaps haven't yet addressed?
I think part of the challenges in this area is actually down to the variety of issues that are arising in legislation as well as in practice that makes this a very crowded space, and can be hard for employers to capture everything. For example, coming down the track are statutory sick pay, fertility leave, remote working, parental leave, parents leave, early miscarriage leave. a heightened focus on mental health and well-being, all hugely important areas. And I think many employers are doing a really, really good job. But I think often this turns into a case-by-case basis by virtue of that very crowded space, when actually maybe a more overarching approach might be more helpful. There are definitely more draws on employers on a whole range of social issues and increasing leaves than ever before, which hits their costs and the time that they can give to various initiatives. So I think that can be a particular challenge, just given the breadth of issues that are coming up. I think sometimes too, it can be difficult if an employee hasn't disclosed their caring needs and maybe things are happening and the employer hasn't supported you to a lack of awareness of the individual's challenges. So that can be a particularly difficult space too. And oftentimes you find yourself kind of retroactively kind of trying to support when things have maybe come to a head. Whereas if it had been sort of in your gift earlier, everybody would have been in a better position. So those, I think, come through a fair bit.
Yeah. And from the point of view of, I suppose, the different HR practices or policies that an organization might have in place, again, what would you see as the priority areas in terms of fostering that kind of culture of that carer-friendly culture, if you like? I mean, you touched earlier on diversity and inclusion, for example.
I think it has to be part of a whole culture approach to the issue, whereby you have a policy or a practice, you communicate to the employees what supports are available, and you train your managers to implement it as needed. And so part of that might include explaining the business case and the reality of working carers, as well as, the accommodations or flexibilities that might be required to keep those individuals connected. So I think that whole, culture approach has to be part of the conversation that you're having across the board. And if that can feature in many policies, because it's the way we do things around here, that's great. But I think maybe you also have to explicitly call it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned managers there, Cara. So if we look at an individual carer's own manager, their line manager, their immediate manager, I mean, it seems to me, and certainly from the research we've done, that they're a critical group of individuals in an organization in terms of the kind of support they can give to people on their team who might have caring responsibilities. And certainly what we're hearing from some carers is that they're finding that support isn't always necessarily there, and it does vary from one manager to another, perhaps. And again, is that something you've kind of come across in your work in IBEC?
We haven't really. I suppose we tend to have employers coming to us to see how they might engage on the subject, what they need to consider, what supports are available out there for them, and that side of things. Oftentimes, though, there is a fear of making the situation worse for an individual who's already struggling with the challenges maybe of work and care, and sometimes a lack of awareness of what flexibilities might be required to make the situation work. Sometimes it can appear at first glance that there's huge accommodations required, when actually that's not always the case. Other times they will have had no knowledge of the caring role, as somebody hasn't chosen to disclose for a variety of reasons. So it can be complex. So I agree with you, though. I think line managers absolutely play a critical role, and it comes back to maybe having that policy, making people aware of it and training the managers to make sure that they're, for the most part, that seems to be the key issue, and working with HR to make that happen.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that issue of training of managers actually perhaps is something, a practical thing perhaps that organizations, might like to look at or might consider, because, it is how do you deal with a situation where an employee does approach you and say, right, here's the situation I'm in, and here's some support, or I'm kind of struggling or whatever. And yeah, it's how do you respond to that? And perhaps for line managers, knowing the supports available internally and externally that perhaps a carer could be directed to as well.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very valid. And as I say, I think part of the challenge maybe is because there are so many moving parts at this point in time on various social issues, that sometimes it can be difficult to be across all of them unless they're live issues in your workplace. And so, it is about, again, back to that culture that it's safe to disclose, that it feels like you'll be heard, and we'll work with you to make this happen. So it is going to require a lot of that. I think using, the diversity and inclusion lens can be very useful. The well-being lens can be very useful, because again, it's about that whole culture approach to how we do things. And if I don't have the information as your line manager, I'll go find out and we'll talk again. But that it's not that there's no question that it's a hard no, or that there's any blockages to that support.
Yeah, absolutely. And the new EU directive on work-life balance, Cara, is an interesting one. So this is the new directive that's due to be introduced in August this year, 2022. And I suppose the aim of that is to improve access to family leave and flexible working arrangements. And I suppose my question is around the extent to which you feel employers and businesses are aware of that directive, and I suppose the entitlements, etc., that it confers on employees and carers.
Yeah, I think many of them are. I suppose from an Irish perspective, we're ahead of the curve in this particular area, with many of the proposed changes already in place or on the way in the coming months, particularly compared to other member states. Our broad concept of carers leave with the temporary unpaid absence from work for at least 13 weeks, and the carers benefit structures and so on, because obviously an individual right to carers leave isn't currently recognised at an EU level, and this directive is obviously going to give that right to 5 working days of carers leave per year. So I think it's going to be a really important one, to really maybe shift the conversation in this area and bring it to the next level. So I think it's a positive move in that area, but I do think Ireland has a good track record already, which is great to be able to build on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose coming back to, you've mentioned COVID-19 and the pandemic on a number of occasions, Karen, I suppose maybe just focusing on that to kind of wrap up our conversation today. But I mean, how do you feel the pandemic has impacted on working family carers just generally?
I think the pandemic really put that spotlight on the needs of employees in this area, because I think when the services like home care and other sort of services were removed, employees were juggling that work, filling the gap and meeting the needs themselves. So we saw employers step up and be very flexible to meet the employees where they were at, and try and work around, whether that was actually giving, time off or flexible arrangements around getting work done when it suited. But I think it also, we were brought into people's homes, and so it was more obvious maybe that there was particular challenges for people. And I imagine for carers that was probably a very daunting time, both in terms of the juggling, but also maybe, being more visible as carers and employees. So I think probably the pandemic leveled things a little bit and demonstrated how big an issue it is for working carers. And that disclosure became necessary. And I don't think that was a bad thing. And I think it really focused the mind of employers of what we need to put in place. I think the removal of supports made things exceptionally difficult for carers, and we know for women in particular, if you had childcare demands on top of that as well, and that you were homeschooling, this was not an easy space. But I think anecdotally also, others found the lack of a commute meant that juggling that they normally do as part of their role as working carers maybe had some upsides as well, because there was a little bit more time available that hadn't been available at other stages. So I don't think it was all bad, but I think it was a difficult space to be in, and certainly as an experiment, it certainly isn't one that anybody, I imagine, would be rushing back to do again. But it certainly gave us a clarity around what we can do by looking at things differently, and that's not a bad way to be. I think we should constantly looking at why are we doing it this way? Could we look at doing it differently? And that maybe offered us an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the option to work from home, I mean, certainly what we've heard from carers, that was really welcomed, for those carers who didn't have that opportunity perhaps prior to the pandemic. It certainly helped to alleviate some of the pressure, perhaps, so going forward, I wondered the extent to which employers are now more open to that option of having the conversation around more flexibility, working from home options and so on.
I think many Irish employers have had or already have started to introduce flexible working policies, um, with the kind of the increased global movement towards those more versatile working arrangements. I think you're right. Many thought remote work or this flexible way of working wouldn't suit their operation, and they've been pleasantly surprised by how well it has in many cases. So I suspect the blended workplace will be very much a strong feature in many workplaces as we kind of try to come back, taking the best of the lessons maybe that we learned during the pandemic. And I think employers recognize that the value that a healthy work-life balance and flexible working can bring to the workplace. We know from research, we see greater employee engagement, diversity and inclusion, staff retention, all being some of the obvious benefits. And we've seen through the incremental legislative developments in employment rights in recent years in Ireland that we already have a range of generous statutory rights which contribute directly to flexibility in the workplace. And these are going to increase, obviously, with the Work-Life Balance Directive being transposed later this year, and the right to request remote working and so on. And I think many employers are also really broadly supportive of flexible working arrangements in excess of those required by statute, where they can be facilitated and agreed at a workplace level, because it's very clear from research that IBEC has been carrying out that where additional flexibility can be accommodated, employers definitely adopt a range of additional measures not required by statute. So things like job sharing or flexi time or working from home, personalised hours, career breaks, sabbaticals, a real plethora of different initiatives that can actually be very useful from an employee's perspective. But they are very much tailored to the individual business or sector needs, because they're not necessarily suitable maybe in all workplaces. So I think it's an interesting time, and one that certainly we're seeing a lot of movement in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly, Cara, in our research and lots of other research elsewhere, it tells us that flexible working is really critical in helping carers remain in the workplace. And that's what the vast majority of carers want. They want to stay working for all sorts of reasons, So
no,
absolutely,
sure.
Absolutely. Cara, thank you so much for your time today. I think you've given us really valuable insights into, how employers support and might support carers in the workplace. So thank you very much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.
We've reached the end of our Carewell conversation for this episode. I'd like to thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more from us, please subscribe to Carewell Conversations on your podcast platform of choice, or alternatively, you will find us at carewellproject.com or across our various social media channels, which are linked in our podcast feed. We'd also like to hear from you, our listeners. Please feel free to leave any comments, feedback or suggestions you may have on any of our social media feeds, or you can contact us directly at carewell@ucd.ie. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us on future Carewell Conversations.